from Mizhaf, and I run across somebody who says, but, Doc, I was addicted, but I had a really happy childhood, and then that's when I issue what I call the happy childhood challenge. It takes about 3 minutes of conversation, just asking a very few basic questions. And like you said, you have these trick questions that you ask people. Well, I have my own bag of tricks as well. And that happy childhood story never stands up to any kind of scrutiny, and it's really important that it doesn't, because otherwise people blame themselves. I had this, one of the saddest letters I received. I mentioned this in The Myth of Normal. It was a guy in Seattle who read my book on addiction, in which I point out and argue that addiction is a response to trauma, and particularly trauma incurred in childhood. And he writes back, he wrote me a letter saying, I found your book very interesting, but I can't blame my mother. I'm a because of myself.
Yeah.
I just felt so bad for the guy.
Yeah.
Because he didn't get it. First of all, he didn't blame his mother. I don't blame parents at all. Parents do their best. It's just that his mother, like maybe I as a parent and perhaps you as a parent, our best wasn't good enough.
Yeah.
Because at that time we still haven't worked out stuff. But there's no blame in recognizing that. But more than that, in that statement that I'm a because of me, he was expressing such self-loathing and self-rejection, which are the hallmarks of trauma.
Yeah.
But with that mind, that's the world he lives in which he is worthless.
Yeah.
And that mind was created by his childhood, but he can't see it.
Yeah, it's so true. I recently had this insight about myself as well, because I had a father and a stepfather who were very disapproving, very judgmental. I was never good enough. My stepfather would say when I said, Dad, I got, 98 on my test. He's like, what happened to the other 2 points? And he wasn't kidding.
Yeah.
And I think that left me with a sense of lack and void that I was trying to fill and always trying to be seen and known and acknowledged. And it's sort of, I've actually built a career on that, and it worked, but now I'm sort of reorganizing all that in my mind and what matters and how I want to live and how I relate to my work and other people and the need for validation. And I never, if you would have said, Mark, do you love yourself? I was, of course I do. Do you have high self-esteem? Yes, I do. Do you have a lot of self-worth? Of course I do. But the truth was, I don't think I really did.
Well, you did based on external conditions.
Yeah. I was like, I really didn't. Yeah. And I've really been cultivating.
Yeah, I'm the same way.
That level of self-worth and self-love. And I actually went to a retreat for myself. I wanted to sort of lock myself away for a month, and I went to Vermont, and I just stayed in a cabin. I pulled out all the distractions, phone, computer, books, TV, nothing. And I just sat with myself, and I walked, and I ate, and I was in nature, and I wrote. And that was one thing I did do. And I was just sort of amazed to sort of begin to realize that I was enough. Like there was, and I had this feeling. It was after this work around my mother and this trauma that I began to kind of have this insight about what was driving me and driving my behavior that, had a lot of good results, but that actually left me not feeling that great, and also sacrificing my health and doing all kinds of things that weren't in service of, my soul and what really mattered.
Yeah.
And I was like, it was such a shock. And a friend of mine said, like, you don't love yourself. You don't have self-worth. I'm like, what do you mean? Like, of course I do. But I realized I didn't.
No,
and the cultivation of that has really changed my whole internal architecture.
Yeah. Yeah. It was, for me, and of course, the way the society works is, as you pointed out a couple of times in this conversation, it rewards us for our self-betrayal.
Yeah.
And so that I was this respected doctor, always available, and he's so kind and all this. And my wife would go into a supermarket and they see the credit card and, are you the wife of the great so-and-so? And she would grit her teeth.
Yeah.
Because the great
at home.
Because the great so-and-so wasn't available at home. He was too busy working all the time. Wasn't available for his own kids, for his own self-care, for the relationship, But the world externally rewards us for that. So as much as it grinds some people down, it elevates some people for the wrong reasons, and for reasons that which then reinforces, and it's very addictive, because if my value depends on how much I'm helping others, it becomes addictive. And the reason it becomes addictive is because there's always a niggling doubt inside, which is maybe unconscious, but says, okay, they want me, but do they want me or do they want what I'm giving them?
Yeah.
So that satisfaction of getting that praise and valuation from the outside is a temporary hit, like somebody's temporary hit from heroin.
Yeah.
And then you have to have it again and again and again.
And our culture rewards that. I mean, it doesn't reward addiction.
Our culture rewards it. So our culture rewards that kind of addiction big time, values it and esteems it. Meanwhile, the soul is being ground to dust inside.
Yeah.
And that's that's another example of the myth of normal.
Yeah. It's so true. I think, and it's, the stories we tell ourselves are often so distorted. And, one of my closest friends, I thought for 20 years he'd had a happy childhood, because he always said he had a happy childhood. And it wasn't until I went away and did a workshop with his sister. We were at the same place. And I started sharing about this, and she's like, "What are you talking about? My mother was crazy, and she did this and she did that, and it was awful." And I'm like, "What?" It was a shock, and it explains so much about his behavior and his patterns, and I think a lot of us do that. We kind of prematurely transcend, in a way, our trauma, and instead of actually going through it, we try to go past it and end up having all these maladaptive patterns of living and being and not functioning in a way that brings us joy and happiness and peace, which is what we're all after anyway.
And as you mentioned earlier, then you go to a physician, and I've often done this in talks that I give. I ask people, well, if you've been to a cardiologist or a respirologist or an oncologist or a dermatologist or a neurologist, any kind of an ologist in the last 5 years, just raise your hands. So, out of 500 people in the room, half of them at least will put their hands up, maybe more. And then I'll say, now keep your hands up if they ask you about any childhood trauma, your current relationship, any stresses at work, how do you feel about yourself as a human being? The hands mostly go down. And yet I say to people, and I say this with full scientific backing, that those questions that are not being asked are what drove you to that doctor in the first place. Whether that trauma manifested in chronic physical illness or mental health conditions or addictions, that's the source. And unless you deal with that source, you're only dealing with symptomatology and not actual cause.
So for people listening, they're probably wondering, wow, maybe I haven't identified this or that as trauma, or maybe actually I did survive a really traumatic childhood I'm aware of. But I'm stuck in these dysfunctional patterns, and I don't know how to break through. I don't know how to rewire. And how do we kind of reconstitute ourselves in this modern world? It's a toxic culture. So if we all got to go off and live in a monastery somewhere, it might be okay. But how do we do that? How do you provide a path for people to think about their own healing?
Well, it's very difficult because partly it's a matter of resources, like those that are fortunate enough economically to be able to afford a good therapist. And I have to emphasize good, because there's a lot of really useless therapies out there. I could talk at great length about that don't go to the heart of the things, but you only deal with the surface. So if you can afford to do that, by all means, just as you take your car in for a tune-up, take yourself in for a tune-up and find out what is grinding and what is not working and where it's not lubricated and, what actually happened. There's lots of therapeutic modalities, and I've developed one. You mentioned that in your introduction, called compassion inquiry, but I don't claim it's a panacea.
What is that?
Well, at this point, I'm only mentioning it as one possible amongst many, many others. There are so many forms of therapy out there, and people can find whatever works for them. So there's my compassion inquiry. There's my good friend Dick Schwartz's internal family systems, which is getting increasing traction and attention for good reason. There is Peter Levine's somatic experiencing.
To body-based therapies.
Body-based therapies, that's right. Craniosacral work, body work such as massages and so on. And very interesting how many times people will get a massage and the therapist will touch a certain part of their body, and all of a sudden the tears come.
Yeah.
Because like Bessel van der Kolk says in his best-selling book, the body does keep the score. The body keeps the score. So the sensory motor therapies, Pat Ogden, I could name many therapies. But if you're going to find a therapy, find one that's trauma informed. Most therapies are not trauma informed. Something like cognitive behavioral therapy mostly deal with, I'm not saying it's categorically, but mostly deal with the surface of things. It doesn't deal with the underlying traumatic template for why you think the way you do. But for people who can't afford a private therapist, or the community programs, there's all kinds of information about trauma. Many of my talks have been uploaded to YouTube, not by me, but just by others on trauma. You can get lots of information, not just from me, but from others as well. There are modalities that anybody can do, such as meditation and mindfulness. Like you spent a month on your own, and basically I've done similar things where you're just alone with your mind. And
that's a scary thing.
It can be a very scary thing for sure. But that means taking a break from the digital world. Actually spending time alone with the mind, and then writing about it, journaling about it, talking to people about it. There's lots of stuff that people can do, and increasingly there are more and more books that are really good guides to understanding and working with trauma. Peter Levine's work, Waking the Tiger, In an Unspoken Voice, that's another one of Peter's work. My various books that you were kind enough to mention, including this most recent one, Bessel's The Body Keeps the Score, Bruce Perry and Oprah's recent book called What Happened to You, about childhood trauma. And memoirs like Educated by Tara Westover, which is quite a wake-up call about trauma and its impacts. So there's lots of stuff out there now. At least we're living in a world where this conversation, although it's not penetrating the medical profession very much, at least it's happening out there in the world.